Now, I'd like to introduce to you our special guest for this morning. Dr. Dorothy Boorse is an aquatic ecologist on the faculty of Gordon College, a 4-year Christian liberal arts school in Wenham, Massachusetts. She has a BS in biology from Gordon College, an MS in entomology from Cornell University, a PhD in oceanography and limnology from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research area is small drying wetlands. Part of her background as a Christian is in the Mennonite tradition, where she learned that care of the natural world is a part of loving your neighbor. She spends time writing and speaking about care of the natural world and the Christian stewardship ethic. Boorse was lead author of the 2011 National Association of Evangelicals report, Loving the Least of These, Addressing a Changing Environment, an initiative designed to promote discussion among American evangelicals about the effect of climate change on poverty. She's on the board of ASABL, Institute of Environmental Studies, and part of the Science Speakers Bureau of the Environmental Justice section of the Ecological Society of America. She is a co-author of Environmental Science Toward a Sustainable Future, published by Pearson. She worked this year with a small team to draft and promote a letter from 200 evangelical scientists to Congress calling for climate action. I welcome to our podium Dr. Dorothy Boorse.
Thank you. What a joy to be with you today. I have not had this privilege before, although I have been sledding on the campus many times. But I was invited to talk on the topic of what I want my pastor to know. I know that many of you desire to go into ministry. How many would that be, want to be a pastor? So, okay. And the rest of you, I'll have a little tiny comment for if you don't want to be a pastor, how this might fit in. But I know that we live in a very busy and soundbite society. So I'm going to tell you my main points right now. These are my 3 main points. The natural world is a wonderful place that brings glory to God and healing to humans who are a part of it. Science is a part of our world. It glorifies God, and serving the scientific community is a part of your job as a pastor. We have a job as stewards of the earth, and you have a job to lead the church in care of creation. Okay. Now, thank you. I think that's all. I thought, it's risky. What if they don't laugh? But yeah, that was the joke at the start. Okay. That is actually all I have to say. I'm just going to illustrate it a little bit. So let's start with the first one. Maybe I could expand a little bit. The natural world is a wonderful place that brings glory to God and healing to humans. This is a beautiful picture of a coral reef, but we could also look at many, many other pictures of the natural world. Here's a couple things I would want to say about the natural world were you my pastor and we having a chat over a cup of coffee. I would say not only is it wonderful, physically beautiful, complex, but it's also interconnected and fierce. Even the fierceness brings glory to God. Humans are a part of the natural world, but have such an unusual level of influence on the rest of it that they are both part and not. And that complexity affects our entire relationship with the rest of the world. Nonetheless, we as Christians have a clear understanding that while we are stewards and we are in some way over the rest of creation, we are never owners of it. God did not give to us that ownership. John Muir once said about the healing power of the natural world, everybody needs beauty as well as bread, places to play in and pray in, where nature may heal and give strength to body and soul. This is one I see, one of my places, as I drive on Conant Street in my morning commute to drop kids off. And one day I saw this tree so beautiful that I thought my heart had stopped. And I stopped and wrote about it and sent it to my friends, saying, you should have seen this tree. I am sure you have moments like that too. And I'll just share a couple other ones to bring you joy. Here is my son at Halibut Point State Park. What could be more beautiful than this? A child of God on a rock made by God. And here is a very different picture. These are terraced fields in China. Humans have adapted this, and while it's very different than the mountainside would look had they not done so, it bears its own beauty. I was one of those children raised in mud and have become an adult who spends time in mud. This is me and a student this past summer in mud in Essex. It is a salt marsh, and that mud represents the accretion over tens of thousands of years, tiny particles trapped by plants, nurturing the next generation of plants, themselves the nursery for most small fish that end up in the marine environment and will end up on your plate. This is a salt marsh right behind Woodman's in Essex, and you may have to cultivate an appreciation of the natural world to see the beauty of it, but that marsh is tremendously beautiful. The small is beautiful. Do you know what these are? These are two kinds of galls. The one in my hand is an oak gall. The one on the stem is on a goldenrod stem. Galls are outgrowths of the plant triggered usually by an insect, but sometimes by a virus or bacterium. And in this case, these are both insects. But oak galls, for 700 years, were used to make one of the chief sources of ink in Western Europe. So they are naturally fascinating. And in case you think, oh my gosh, she's so lucky, she gets to walk around and think about oak galls, you'd be right. That's exactly right, because it's a great joy. So take a little bit of your day and walk around just enjoying. Now that's the scale I work on most of the time. But nature is wild and wonderful and fierce and brings glory to God on a large scale too. This is a fierce storm. And you know, it would be tempting to think that anything that brings an inconvenience or potential harm to humans comes from the fall. But I tell you, that's wrong. In fact, the Bible makes it very clear that God created animals that can bite. They're supposed to do so. And I'm sorry if you don't like it. In fact, the Bible created giant crystal plates that move across the mantle and makes mountains rise through earthquakes and volcanoes. And guess what? Hurricanes are the way God disperses energy from the hot areas of the earth to the cooler areas of the earth. So, wow, we are in for a wild ride. And the fact that it's not always 72 degrees right about where we are is not really very important to God. That's my read of it anyway. So, fortunately, there's a couple other people that think so too, because this is, again, another person describing the spiritual impact of a storm. A few minutes ago, every tree was excited, bowing to the roaring storm, waving, swirling, tossing their branches in glorious enthusiasm like worship. But although to the outer ear, these trees are now silent, the author says about a storm that has passed, their songs never cease. Every hidden cell is throbbing with music and life, every fiber thrilling like harp strings, while incense is ever flowing in the veins and leaves. No wonder hills and groves are God's first temples. There is a rich history and tradition of people praising God for the wonders of nature. Be a part of that, even the parts that you are not very familiar with, because God says in the Bible that he formed the Leviathan. Now, I am sure that if I was up at the seminary, I'd hear a lot of you talk about what exactly a Leviathan is. I don't know. I know it's big and prowls and frolics in the ocean, and God says it's great. So I put up some pictures of things I thought were big, proud, frolicked in the ocean, and God would say was great. And you can pick which one you think that means. But one thing that we don't always talk about when we talk about the beauty of nature is the complexity of the services it provides us besides our own enjoyment. Ecologists talk about these as ecosystem services. So while that marsh in Essex is beautiful to me because I've learned to know what everything is, it also provides Essex with flood control. It dampens the huge waves coming off of the Atlantic in every storm. It provides safety for small fish that will later, as I said, leave to grow in the ocean. These services we take for granted, but knowing about them and thanking God for them should be a part of our worship as well. Now, I think we got that there. One of the things that drew me to science was the artistic beauty of it. And I thought, if I had a little time with the pastor and they couldn't escape, I would inflict some of that beauty on them, because this was one of the reasons I got a degree in entomology. The eyes of flies are so beautiful. They are like jewelry. In fact, jewelry is an attempt to imitate the eyes of flies under a microscope. I'm not kidding. That's what they look like. I had a moment in my undergrad training that was a spiritual moment of connection to God, looking through a microscope at the eye of a fly. And at the top of my head came off, and in it came. I just thought nothing was more glorious than that. Of course, subsequent to that, I've seen some other things. And do you know that pollen is one of the most beautiful things you could ever see? No, probably you don't, because you don't have access to electron microscopes. But if you Google it, you don't have to get on the electron microscope yourself. You can enjoy a wild array of seeing the beauty of the natural world on scales you cannot get to yourself through modern technology. That includes larger scales as well. And this beautiful piece of art is what? It's got water. It is an aerial landscape of a section of New Zealand. Would you have known that? I don't think that's intuitive. I would have thought it was an abstract painting myself, but that's actually a photograph of a landscape. Well, if you were my pastor, I would spend this time enthusing about the natural world. But then I would want to plead with you about something. I would want to tell you very briefly about my experience as a scientist in the church. Because the church does not always recognize that science is a legitimate human occupation, in fact, a necessary one that brings us great good, that serving and that you, as pastors and theologians, serve the scientific community. I'm an aquatic ecologist. This is me in my natural garb out in the field. And this is a similar sight when it is dry. The places I study are unique, small habitats that protect the things that live there because they don't have water all the time and thus have fewer predators. But I have found that my great joy in finding out about these places is not always supported by my peers in the church. In fact, as a scientist, I've heard these things. Rush Limbaugh, who is not a pastor, I realize, but many Christians believe he speaks God's truth. You can't believe in God and global warming, he recently said. And guess what? 9,000 scientists wrote to him to say, that's not true. That's not true. Go soak your head. Okay, maybe they didn't say that part, but I hope slightly more compellingly and much closer to home is something I received when I was invited as a scientist to speak to a group of young adults at my own church. And I was asked to share my expertise about global climate change. And in the course of that conversation, one of the leaders of the group said to me, "Why should we believe scientists when they have a mostly godless worldview?" Now, I don't know if you get how offensive that is. Please go there with your imagination and just think if you baked a cake and somebody said, "I can't eat your cake because you have a godless worldview," or you went to your medical doctor. Do you check that they have a godly worldview before you believe them about their heart? But it was even worse than that because they knew I was a Christian. So they had asked me. So what that said to me as a scientist was, well, there's scientists and then you're not really a scientist. Or there's Christians and then there's you're not really a Christian. So I'm just going to plead with you. You probably would never consider doing this, but on a regular basis, I hear lovely fellow believers say things like, Christians say this and scientists say this. Don't. Just don't. That is so painful. So, this is what I want my pastor to know about science. Scientists need Christ. Many people leave the church over the types of things I just described. Christians in the sciences who stay in the church struggle. They struggle all the time with people saying random stuff that doesn't make any sense, or constantly undermining the possibility that they could be a scientist and a Christian at the same time. So that's about experience of a Christian in the sciences. But I also want to say a couple of comments just about the nature of science. Sometimes people distrust scientists because they're always changing what they say. But it's like driving down a road. When the road curves, you turn your wheel. Scientists are getting new information all the time. The fact that they're changing what they're saying, they're not changing zzz, zzz. They're changing Sometimes those subtleties are not expressed in the media, and you think they just flipped on a dime. But in fact, what they did was something fairly subtle, corrective. So, science is always changing, and it's supposed to. Scientists are not proving, they're forming a more accurate model of the world. And they are supposed to live in a world of uncertainty because we don't have all the information. So that's all I'm going to say, I think, about that. Except I will give this one dilemma. This is a quote from a geologist, Kirk Johnson, and he said, "Early on in my life, I sort of confronted the fact that fossils existed, and while there was a deep history to the planet," meanwhile at Saturdays, he was in one of those churches on Saturdays, I'd be hearing that the planet was 6,000 years old, and when I was 15 years old, I found an outcrop on the side of the road which had lake varves, little layers of the lake, and I counted a few inches and did a multiplication, and right there on the side of the road in British Columbia, there was 30,000 years of time, and I was like, ooh, there's something not right there. So I'm just going to say to you, you are going into the world. You will be in positions of authority in Christendom. You can help to solve this. This man left the church. I am in the church. But you need to speak into a world of scientists as much as any other world. Now, we are in our last few minutes. And if I was to say what I wanted a pastor to know about environmental science in particular, I would say you do really have to be an expert when you're dealing with your congregation, but never be dismissive of science or your congregants. And I would also say this about the environment in particular. Not paying attention to it is a message as much as paying attention to it. And if you think you can somehow just avoid all controversies, you're mad in the head. Young people are leaving the church in droves because it is, in their minds, irrelevant. Which leads me to our last little short section. Creation, that we know is so beautiful, is groaning from the consequences of human actions. We have a job as stewards of the earth, and you have a job as leaders of the church in the care of creation. But it's not a new task. This is part and parcel of caring for our neighbors and caring for the poor. The reason for that is that the poor are harmed most by environmental degradation. Now, in the interests of time, I'm going to skip a couple of slides, and I'm going to give you two stories that illustrate that, so bear with me. These are just books about the environment if you wanted them, and that was a little bit about the Judeo-Christian ethic. I just want to share these stories about loving your neighbor. This is a picture from India of the most polluted, river in the world. Along its banks sit 90 pharmaceutical production plants producing drugs that are largely consumed in Western Europe and America. In the water are levels of every kind of drug at levels at which you would take them if you had conditions for which they were prescribed. They include anti-cancer treatments. They include female reproductive hormones. They include heart medications. The people who live there do not have options not to drink the water.
while people who own the factories live elsewhere. That type of story is replicated not tens of times, not hundreds of times, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of times around the globe. This is an opportunity for the church to be a voice, to be an actor, and to be a problem solver. In 2011, the National Association of Evangelicals put out a short booklet on which I was the lead author called Loving the Least of These, Addressing a Changing Environment. This was specifically about climate change and poverty, making the case that if you say that you care for the poor and you say you care about being a witness to the world, you cannot pretend or ignore climate change as a reality. In that report, we made a biblical case for the basis for Christian engagement. We talked about a changing environment, a tiny little bit on the science, made readable for the public. And we talked about how the climate affects the poor. Most notably, poor people can't just pick up and move when their house washes away. Poor people don't have insurance. Poor people can't cope if their crops fail. Poor people become refugees at much higher rates than everybody else. And then we talk about some things that you can do. But sometimes it's easy to believe that environmental degradation and issues are out there affecting other people in some way not connected to you. And in case you are tempted to think that, I'm gonna draw it a little closer to home. This is not the most recent disaster I could have used as an illustration, but the pictures were compelling and I like it. This is from 2008, when an earthen wall holding back 525 million gallons of coal ash slurry gave way at a coal-fired power plant in Tennessee. It released those gallons of toxic slurry onto 400 acres of land, covering a dozen homes. Nobody was killed, and major rivers were spared. But the minute the news cycle changed, the people of Harriman, Tennessee were left with yards of toxic waste and have to live there. This is our world. We could find pictures closer to home like this. Sometimes when I talk to people who don't have environmental degradation on the top of their list, and they're Christians, they're overwhelmed by thinking of that scale. So here's my best advice. First, what not to do. You will do no good to the world or your congregation or your schools where you teach or any place else if you live in despair. So check it off and take it off the list. You will do no good to anybody if you ignore. Check it off, take it off the list. On this topic, like every difficult issue in our society, we walk a tightrope and live in a tense place where we acknowledge reality and we choose hope every day. I'm going to ask you to do that, to rise to the occasion as people who are leaders. So in your church or ministry, make caring for the created world part of caring for your congregation and part of the gospel message you and your congregants take to the world. Now, let me add, I have talked about this to a pastor because that was one of the topics I could choose from. But suppose you're a theologian instead? Well, let me just say, pastors need you to shore them up. When you talk to your congregation about the care of the environment, there better be 15 books by smart theologians behind you that tell you exactly why that makes sense from the Bible, because you shouldn't have to come up with that right off the top of your head. So theologians rise to the occasion. Sit up, take notice, and give us some stuff we need. That's true for the scientists as well. So just in case we miss them, here are my main points. The natural world is a wonderful place that brings glory to God and healing to humans who are a part of it. Science is a part of our world. It also glorifies God, and serving the scientific community is part of your job as a pastor. We have a job as stewards of the earth, and you have a job to lead the church in care of creation. And this is a picture of a little bit of your own creation here at Gordon-Conwell. Thank you very much.